First of all, I'm a recovering sysadmin, and that means a number of things. First of all, I have a very different worldview than most developers. Even though I've done development over the years, I have a pessimistic outlook on life, and so if you're hoping to go into the break feeling warm and fuzzy, you probably won't. This will probably be a depressing thought. I'm sorry. I've been involved in open source for almost a quarter of a century now, which seems like a really long time, and I feel really old when I say that. I run the infrastructure team at the Apache Software Foundation, so the 7 full-time employees report up in me, which is really strange because I'm a volunteer at the ASF. I've been on the board for the Apache Software Foundation for the Fedora project and been involved in a number of other communities in the open source ecosystem. And thankfully today, BlackBerry sends me paychecks every couple of weeks to work on open source for them. If you want to heckle me, you're free to heckle me here in the audience, or you can also heckle me on Twitter, and you'll see my Twitter ID there. So why do we care about SBOM? Why do we care about the formats? And does this really matter? Why are we spending time sitting inside a room that's relatively dark compared to the wonderful outside, talking about lists of software? There is a lot of regulation that's coming around it, whether that's in the finance sector or the healthcare industry. There is some regulation that's going to be applied that is going to be inevitable. And that is something that we really haven't seen heretofore in either in open source or in commercial software, is that you've essentially got to be accountable for the software that you're including. Governments around the world are realizing kind of the mass of the problem that they're dealing with. So it's not just that we've got people who are shipping software that solves problems for us. We've also got people who are shipping software that causes problems for us. And governments are figuring this out, and they're realizing that they either need to deal with it, and so they stand up programs like FedRAMP, where you have to have a process that has some maturity so that you're not causing problems when they give you money. And also it has an impact on the private sector, which of course, they're supposed to be safeguarding. And it might be important for someone to know what software is actually running. There were days when you could ship a black box and the customers would accept that. And those days are by and large gone. As a matter of fact, you'll see now that customers are probably scanning your software with the same tools that you're scanning with. The number of customers who will take your product, put it through Black Duck to figure out what are you actually including is actually becoming pretty common. So when we talk about this, there's this desire to know what's running. But as a sysadmin, I would tell you that the ops guys have always cared about this. And so I say it's a skirmish. Maybe it's been going on long enough that it's really a war. And we've always been at war with East Asia. It's always been a conflict of what format's going to win out. It's always been a conflict about what tools we use. So just for historical purposes, I want to look back. We used to have this, right? So you want to install some software, and I'm a Linux guy by trade, so we have this great manifest of here's the software, here's what it does, here's version, here's build number, there's even going to be a link to the build scripts that are included there. We included all of that. As a matter of fact, if you had really old sysadmins, particularly the ones with gray beards, and I'm only gray beardless because I don't have a beard. They would insist that you don't bundle dependencies, that you don't include software without fully putting it through this process. And then that made things like, oh, I need to see what security updates are available. Well, no problem. I'll query what packages have updates that are available, because I can hopefully trust my operating system vendor. Or maybe I need to do this in a different format, so we can do this with devs too. Or you can do this on Windows. But in the end, packages did not win this war. There's a number of problems there. First, I blame developers, and in particular, I'll go out and say the Ruby folks have made this super complicated. But they weren't really the original cause, because at least they used a package manager. The folks who would take code and then basically copy it into their source code, including 5, 6, 7 other projects inside their one package, destroyed this. And because we didn't have a way of enforcing this, and because it wasn't universal, when you needed both Windows, Linux, maybe Solaris and AIX in the same environment, we lost control of what software was there. We've also, though, increased velocity. And I said I blame the Ruby folks. Ruby made such fast progress. And you could go from 1 week, your package working with a stated dependency, and that dependency completely breaking your product in a week. So that velocity has changed the way that we have to include software. And you'll see folks, there are even folks 2 weeks ago on Hacker News who were complaining about the guidelines around packaging software for Debian because it was so strict and so hard to actually get software that was shippable. And then we had every platform using something different, right? So packages ended up not being the right format for us to track what software was on our machine, even though you'll still find some places that do this well. So let's talk about today's software bill of materials format and see what, the folks who are the real players today when we're trying to figure out what software is running on a given device or in a given environment. So we'll start with SWID, and it is software identification. There's actually an ISO standard. It's like someone thought about this in advance and wrote a standard. But in many ways, it was not targeted with the viewpoint of creating an SBOM, and it certainly wasn't created with the viewpoint of managing things like security. Instead, this was really focused on licensing and entitlements, and that's kind of where it originated. It has a sister ISO standard that literally is called software entitlements. A nonprofit group has formed around that called Tag Vault, and they're trying to set up normalization. If this sounds a little familiar, this legacy goes back a little bit, and we'll talk about some of the predecessors to SWID. But this has been around for a while, and people have been trying to build this out. The problems, though, is when you look at some of the tooling, what does the tooling do? It goes back and looks at those RPMs and DEBs and says, hey, tell me about the software that's included in this, and I'll create a set of tags, and we'll be able to describe the software. The Linux tool does that via packages, and that's great. That may work for containers, unless you build your containers by installing all of your dev tools, pulling down your source code, building, and not including that in a package itself. Maybe that tool will work in some places, but we get back to that problem of, do I have to manually attest, manually scan each package to do this? There are some other tools that are available to members of Tag Vault, so you actually have to join, pay some money up front to join Tag Vault, and they'll provide you with a number of tools, either at cost or for a nominal fee. And if you actually want to validate your bill of materials that you generated with SWID, you can do that with a tool that NIST has available. But this isn't perfect, right? So in many ways, when you talk about generating one of these SWID tags for your software, they assume in the documentation that you have one thing, and that thing doesn't really have that many dependencies. And that's how it was originally, it was assumed that the creator of the software was going to apply a SWID tag, and then we would have this domino effect when it was included by other folks. And that hasn't taken off. As a matter of fact, the open source community seems pretty put off by having to pay 178 Swiss francs to read the standard. And because so many of the folks involved in open source are individuals, they also don't want to go join Tag Vault and get access to their tools. That said, it's an ISO standard, and we all love ISO standards because it's something we can actually go and point to and say, hey, we've achieved this, let me check that box off. We can put it in our marketing literature, our sales guys love that, and very large customers and .govs will specify, hey, we really need to be able to see what's in there, please follow this standard. There's also Perl, and Perl is the exact opposite of the software language that it shares a name with, right? So there's very little obfuscation. It's very simple. It's very easy to generate. But again, we're focused on packages and repositories, but this is seeing a bit of groundswell in support. So here's some examples, right? So I'm going to pull foobar from npm, and I'm going to pull this version. Or I'm going to pull a GitHub URL at a specific hash. Or again, a specific version from NuGet, and that's going to inform basically what's in the package. And I'm doing that by looking at dependencies generally. So we'll look at your Maven POM file, and we'll figure out dependencies and transitive dependencies, and then we'll generate basically a list like this. One of the problems though with Perl is it doesn't handle non-packaged software. So there are a number of elements, and you can have this being software from GitHub or from GitLab or anywhere else that you choose, and you can pull that as a hash. But otherwise, it's expecting you to have something in an RPM, an NPM, jar file that you got from Maven Central, and that you're going to be specifying it from that package. And there's a lot of software out there, both legacy and today, that just doesn't conform to that. There's also only 7 elements in the spec, and I love the fact that it's so simple, but I also dislike the fact that it doesn't give us enough complexity to deal with all of the problems that people have promised SBOM is going to solve for us. So when you look at the current spec for Perl, there are only 2 elements that are required, the name and the type. So I can tell you that I've got an RPM of OpenSSL, and that is technically a complete Perl descriptor of software that's installed. Not version, not how it's used, not how it was built, or where it came from. And then there's SPDX. And this is one of the other large players in this current conversation around SBOM. And there's this work group, which is a very loosely defined work group because it's not part of a real standards org. They've got a freely available standard that's published under a Creative Commons license, and they also did not start out with solving the SBOM problem as their purpose. Instead, they were trying to deal with license compliance because for a number of companies, especially those who ship a lot of open source, dealing with license compliance issues is a big deal because they don't want to be like Best Buy and have to give up a ton of TVs that contain open source and not be able to sell those. But again, this is designed around software vendors who need to describe the consumed software. And there's nice tools. They work to varying degrees. You can use Black Duck to produce an SPDX list of software. You can use Fossology to do the same. And there's some other tools that are coming out of other groups to basically produce this bill of materials based upon what they find in your software. But they would all produce different lists with different degrees of depth. There's also a few other folks. There's CPE. There are people who say, hey, we're just going to manage all of this with package coordinates. Maven's fine. doing org.apache.struts, we can tell you that you've got struts, we can tell you what version, you have all of the information that you need. Cyclone DX has a relatively robust tool set, but they don't have a whole lot of adoption, and they basically are one of the few folks championing their own format and set of tooling. And then Common Platform Enumeration. How many folks remember CPE? Okay. So CPE was a standard that predates SWID, and basically they were looking how to describe and how to enumerate all of the facets of a system. So let's start with who produced it, Red Hat, what packages are on it, what version, and creating a dictionary that you could then describe any given system. There is some talk of interoperability, and I don't personally hold a lot of faith in this because I don't trust that we can have a perfect one-to-one interoperability between these two. But both SPDX and SWID have said that they're going to provide interoperability so that you can read and process each other's standard with their own tools. Maybe that'll happen. It's today a promise. If you're still using CPE, and I hope that's not true of most folks here, NIST has some guidelines and guidance on how to basically convert that to SWID and give you some interoperability there. But there are still a lot of problems, right? And the biggest problem is naming. So I participate in the Akazi open source work group, and so we're comparing product security list of software that causes us problems in open source and that we want to make sure has a lot of focus. And so we're, companies, large companies are coming, putting their list from basically product security investigations and product security vulnerabilities that are reported in, and we're starting to look and say, hey, all right, let's figure out what is common between all of us. With 10 companies, there were 5 different names for the Apache web server. No one was able to agree on that. So if you go to query, hey, am I running HTTPD? Well, no, obviously not. You're running one of these 4 other names for Apache. Because Debian calls it Apache 2, and other folks call it Apache, and people will call it the Apache web server, and there is no common language that we can use to really define that you've got the web server present. And this is a simple example. Imagine this expanded out. Now, there's some solutions there, but this is a common problem. Do you have OpenSSL? What about if you're running Red Hat Enterprise Linux and they tell you a specific version that you have? And that version, the version number at least, is still vulnerable. You've still got this naming problem where we have these pieces of discrete software that may be the same or may be different, and we don't have a great way of comparing them between, not with any of the current tools that are in place. The reality to me feels very shoehorned. And the question is, what do you want out of software bill of materials? If you're looking for it to solve all of your security problems, none of these are going to do it. If you're looking for it to give you an inventory, maybe it does it with some work on your part. But frankly, the SBOM effort has not yet gotten to the point where we are able to concretely define what problem SBOM is going to solve. Every person that you talk to about this has a different answer, and that is reflected in the formats that are out there available to us. And for better or worse, none have won mindshare, which means you've, again, got this problem that we had decades ago. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. Thanks for listening. Again, you can heckle me, and feel free to reach out at any of these addresses. Thanks very much. Yeah, so I thought, man, I'm having to run through some content here because he's telling me I've got 3 minutes left.
I'm just trying to keep you on your toes for an exciting speaker challenge.
I appreciate the challenge, right? I mean, if I'm going to come to Hawaii, I should definitely be up for it, right? So, I talk about SBOM being subjective, and I think this is really my pessimism coming in. I don't think it'll be any surprise that you will find that customers are proactively asking you about security vulnerabilities in your products. Now, hopefully, you will have an understanding that, hey, I included OpenSSL, and that OpenSSL version was vulnerable. People are going to be asking me. And that's fine. That's great. Hopefully, you've got a prepared response. You can go back to them and say, yes, that version of OpenSSL is vulnerable. We're not using it in the way that's vulnerable. This is not a concern. At some future date, we will be upgrading so that your scanners will not report this false positive. The reality is that SBOM is going to make that problem much worse, right? So instead of them being able to turn on Black Duck and go through the hoops of actually querying what software you have in there, you're going to be providing them a document. You may be mandated by regulation or contract to provide them a document that lists all of the open source. So you should expect that the number of people who are going to be asking you those questions is going to go up. When we look at number of open source vulnerabilities and compare that to what actually translates into vulnerabilities, I'd love to hear what Microsoft's numbers are on this, but I'm guessing that you're looking at 30 to 40% may actually result in a real vulnerability. Having seen numbers from a number of companies, not the fact that an open source library that you use is actually vulnerable to something doesn't mean that your product that uses that is vulnerable. Heartbleed, for instance, single function call. If you weren't using that function call, you weren't vulnerable. But how do you figure that out? So I think SBOM is going to generate a lot more work. And we haven't figured out how to deal with that. We haven't figured out how to describe, this is the software that we're using, this is how we're using it, and I can tell you just by querying whether we're vulnerable to that particular aspect, or I can test it out. And so there's a lot of pushback from software vendors who don't want to give this away and don't want to incur the extra work. But one of the bad realities that you'll also see is that people also don't have any idea what software is running in their system. And I mean this as the vendor who ships software, right? When I look, so I work on open source at BlackBerry. When I look at some of the BlackBerry packages, I look at 1,000 plus open source components in a single product. There is nobody on that development team who understands that full scope. They can't. That's just not maintainable by a single person in their mind. There are going to have to be tools, and SBOM may be one of the tools that solves that problem for us, but we're going to have tools that solve the what's here, but then getting from what's here to sharing that with the world to being able to manage that, we haven't figured out yet, and frankly, I don't think there's a lot of folks who have a plan. On the other side, you have consumers who don't trust at all what these people are shipping out, because they shipped me a medical device that shut down my hospital because it had a vulnerable version of struts in it, and it took down the entire hospital network. Well, now I don't trust that vendor, and the vendor may or may not tell me that I'm vulnerable. Can I believe what they're actually telling me? And so what we actually have is a lack of trust, and we're trying to use SBOM as a relationship salvation. And we've got to figure out how we can, from a technical aspect, actually declare what's on the system, because that is important. The BOFHs of the world want to know what's in the system, and at the same time not necessarily turn that into constant panic about what is the sky is falling because you included OpenSSL and there's now a new vulnerability. I don't think that any of the SBOM camps have won mind share yet, and thankfully we don't have a whole lot of regulation in place yet. But I think it's going to be important for product security folks and security folks in general to be part of that conversation, but realize that this is not a panacea. People expect that this is going to solve all of their problems, and they don't realize it's just a different set of problems they're going to end up dealing with, I'm afraid. Can you use a package lock file? Can you? Yeah. So the problem becomes one of adoption again. And I assume this is, and whoever asked this, are you talking about in terms of dealing with the constant upgrade churn and not being able to state this? I'm trying to look at, this was recently. Tell me the context in which you're asking.
Yeah, so I was just trying to see if, like, for a web app, where you have a jar lock file, and it has all the transit dependencies and then the hash and everything. Is that useful?
Can you repeat your question one more time?
Is it okay if I repeat it? Yeah, so he was talking about you have a web app with all the dependencies and transient dependencies, and you have hashes for all of those, and is that useful? I think it's greatly useful. The question is, can you apply that to every environment? Because we've apparently decided to boil the ocean with SBOM, and there are people who are talking about, I've got an IoT device and I need to know if that's vulnerable. I've got a car that's connected to the internet, or maybe not. I also need to know what the software is in that. So maybe. I told you this is going to be a pessimistic talk. If I had the solutions to solve all the world's problems, I'd be a much richer man. Thanks very much, folks.